Let's tell you now about 9 million registered voters in Kenya who will head to the polls on Tuesday to elect the country's president. Members of the National Assembly and the Senate. Deputy President William Ruto is going head-to-head with veteran politician Raila Odinga. Let's get some context in terms of what may possibly play out on Tuesday. We're joined by senior country and political risk analyst at Signal Risk, that's Menzi Ndlovu, and multimedia journalist Patrick Gathara, and he's joining us from the East African nation of Kenya. Gentlemen, thank you very much for availing yourself this morning. Perhaps let me start with you, Patrick. In terms of the sentiment on the ground, many headlines screaming about how people may possibly vote along ethnic lines, but when you take a look at people's reality on the ground, does it suggest that there might be a shift in this pattern?
Thanks for having me. I think while ethnicity has always been a big part of elections in Kenya, and this is no different, I think it's not been as emphasized in this election cycle as before. So underlying everything, yes, there is, people will be to a large extent voting along ethnic lines, but also in terms of the cross-ethnic, we might call it, voting. I think you're going to have much more of that, and also the sort of narrative and the rationale, if you will, for voting has kind of changed, because this election, more than most, has really almost been presented in terms of issues, and while that might be sort of what do you call it? Just window dressing, to a large extent. But I think it's still a step, because it's something that in past elections has not really been sort of so prominent in our election debates.
Menzi, let me come to you. You believe that the outcome is far from a foregone conclusion. Perhaps talk to us about the front runners for this election and a bit of context into who they are.
Absolutely. So good afternoon, or rather good morning to you and to your viewers. So you have 4 contestants for the presidential leg, but only 2 are considered front runners. You have the current deputy president, William Ruto, who was the front runner, and then you have a former prime minister and opposition leader, Raila Odinga, who was the front runner. And what's really interesting is the subtext around their candidacy, which we describe as soap opera-esque. So Ruto, who is currently the deputy president, is running as an outsider, which is quite anomalous. And then you have Odinga, who is an opposition leader, running as an insider. And it really speaks to the effervescence, the dynamic nature of Kenyan politics. Now, these guys both have relatively strong backing within their respective constituencies, and they have significant political clout. Now, Odinga comes into the election with the backing of the current president, with the backing of the current ruling party, and he's basically ran on a narrative of continuity, all right, and pledging to continue on some of the good work that the ruling Jubilee Party and President Uhuru Kenyatta has done to improve on that, to introduce certain welfare systems, certain transfers. And then Ruto, who is the insider, has ran on an anti-establishment and a narrative that proposes to overhaul the current status quo. And he stood out there and critiqued the current administration for failing on certain objectives, irrespective of the fact that he was part of it. And he's attributed the current administration's failings to Odinga, who has obscured President Kenyatta's policy trajectory, and he's come in there and pledged to overhaul Kenya's political system, make it more conducive to more universal gain, overhaul the dynastic politics within Kenya, and ensure a system that is much more beneficial to Kenyans on the ground, and ensure that the man on the ground effectively benefits. And I think that sort of that backdrop sets us up for an election that's A, unique, and B, highly competitive and is pretty high stakes.
When Menzi Patrick speaks of the man on the ground benefiting, Kenya is no exception to the rule, just like many other African nations. You've got people who are quite elderly who are rowing the boat, and you've got young people who are watching them and saying, your shoulders are getting tired, let's help you paddle this boat, yet they refuse to leave, the front seat. So when it comes to young people in Kenya, what is the sentiment and what have we seen in terms of voting patterns? Does this matter to them at all?
Well, we've seen quite a lot of apathy from the youth, especially in this election cycle, which is kind of new, I think, again in Kenya. It's not something that we had seen prior. Obviously, across, and I think it's not just in Kenya, across the continent, across the world, young people are less likely to vote than the older generations. But in Kenya's case, even with the push to try and register new voters, it was basically an abysmal failure. The Electoral Commission was expecting to have registered, I think, up to 10 million new voters in this cycle, and they managed less than a quarter of that. And this would have been new, younger voters. The proportion of younger people voting or registered to vote has actually fallen. If you compare it to 2017, it was about half the electorate in 2017 was under 35. And in this cycle, it's only about 38%. So there is sort of a disengagement by the youth with the electoral process. I think a lot of it has to do with what Menzi mentioned. I like the term that he used, that this is sort of like a soap opera. It's a game that politicians are playing. And a lot of times that game has very little to do with the interests of the people, of the young people, and they don't see themselves reflected there. They don't see, they see the older generation has kept voting. Since 1950s, Kenyans have been voting fairly regularly every 5 years. And they have not seen how that has delivered any change. It's still the same faces that are running the country. To a large extent, it is all about access to public resources and about looting public resources. And for most people, basically, whether or not you change the politicians who run the country, it doesn't seem to change the policies on which it is run. And the foundation on which it is run. And I think this is what then accounts for many young people simply staying away from it. Just one final thing. When you look at the people who are standing for office, so Ruto, who talks about change, is saddled a lot with allegations about corruption. He was indicted by the ICC for essentially mass murder, in relation with the 2007 elections, So there's not much change. Odinga is supported by somebody who was co-indicted with Ruto. Whose own family is known basically to have, since independence, to be looting, Kenya. So on both sides, you do not see change. It's basically two sides of the same coin, and I think that's part of the reason why many young people simply are staying away.
Menzi, then that begs the question, if we're saying that politics is a soap opera, it's all a game, young people are very disengaged. This is the youngest continent in terms of the youth population and the sheer number of young people that we have in Africa. So just how sustainable then is this game?
Look, at face value, unsustainable, highly unsustainable. I think we've seen the consequences of politics that fail to work for the youth and the kind of outcome that it brings about. We saw that in the Arab Spring, and we've seen that in other jurisdictions across the world, partly in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka as well. And this is highly unsustainable for the continent. But I think we've also seen an upside where candidates who genuinely position themselves as vassals of youth interests, and they pursue it genuinely, the youth can be tapped up, and the youth is willing to participate in democratic processes where they feel that there is genuine hope and where they feel that the candidate that's on the poster is legitimately representing their interests. For instance, in Zambia, where we had a youth bulge come up in its masses to vote for change in President Hakainde Hichilema. And so in that respect, it's not a foregone conclusion. It's not all dystopian, but I think it'll take a fundamental change in our politics on the continent to tap into these youth grievances and legitimately carry out their interests.
May Patrick, very quickly for us, for the interest of time, are there fears of violence, in light of or just before the election on the 9th of August?
Not necessarily violence. I think the scope for violence is fairly reduced. It's reduced by a couple of factors. First, we don't have an incumbent running, which is one of the major factors for having electoral violence historically. Secondly, we've got a much more credible Supreme Court and judiciary in general, which has already annulled one election in 2017. And I think there's much more faith that if there is a dispute, it's not going to be sorted out in the streets. It can be presented in court. And I think that pretty much is what more or less guarantees that if there is violence, and there might be and there will be some violence, of course, but it's not going to be at the scale of what we saw in 2007. I just wanted to say one thing about what Menzi had mentioned. I think the youth are disengaging essentially from electoral politics. But there are other modes of engagement in a democracy that I think are much more important. The participation in the 5 years in between elections, and I think we can see a bit of a climb on that. At least in Kenya, especially with the whole devolution after 2010, and I think that it's actually a good thing when we de-emphasize elections, because we have put too much stake and too much. Or we've invested too much in this idea that all we need to do is elect the right person and then everything will work. But if people are able to engage at other levels in between the elections, in those 5 years when the stealing happens, when all the policies are being passed, and they're able to influence that, then I think for me that would be actually an improvement and a maturity of our democracy.
Points well made.
Waiting to stand in line.
Unfortunately, because of time, we're not able to continue. But thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Patrick Gathara is a multimedia journalist joining us from Nairobi in Kenya. Menzi Ndlovu, senior country and political risk analyst at Signal Risk. Thank you.